She had no idea that the single-dollar bill, taped to a notarized page inside her father's will, was not an insult at all but a precisely engineered legal device, the specific, deliberate mechanism Ohio probate attorneys recommend when a parent wants to do two things simultaneously. Name a child as a beneficiary, so the will cannot later be challenged on the grounds that she was overlooked, and signal, unmistakably, that everything else had already been handled somewhere else entirely. My father left me $1 in his will. My brother got the house, the accounts, the cabin on the lake. He stood up at the reading, smiling, already mentally spending what he believed was his. Then the attorney opened a second envelope, sealed, notarized, dated 4 months before my father died. And by the time she finished reading the first paragraph aloud, my brother had gone pale enough that the paralegal stepped toward him with a chair. This is the story of what my father actually did with his estate. Why the dollar was never the real bequest, and what was waiting in the envelope underneath it. My name is Odalys Ferreira. I am 39 years old. I am a senior actuarial analyst at an insurance firm in Columbus, Ohio, where I have spent 14 years building the specific professional discipline of reading documents the way most people skim them. Line by line, assuming nothing, treating every clause as a deliberate choice made by someone who understood exactly what they were signing. Because in my line of work, an unread clause is usually the one that ends up costing someone everything. I bring that discipline to my own life by habit now, which is the only reason I did not collapse, fall apart, or storm out of an attorney's office in Dublin, Ohio, on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when a woman named Harriet Boswell read aloud, in a calm and unhurried voice, that my father had left me exactly $1. My father's name was Desmond Ferreira. He died in January at 76, from complications following a second stroke, in a hospital room in Westerville, with me sitting on one side of the bed and my brother, Cole, sitting on the other. The last image I have of the three of us together, before the will reading split that image into something considerably more complicated. I want to tell you about my father honestly, because the simplest version of this story would frame him as a man who simply favored one child over another. And that version, while containing a kernel of the visible truth, misses almost everything that actually mattered about who he was and what he ultimately did. My father built a modest but genuinely successful HVAC contracting business over 31 years, starting with a single truck and a phone number on a magnetic sign, growing it, by the time he sold the company 8 years before his death, into a regional operation with 11 employees and a client base across 3 counties. He was not an emotionally expressive man. He showed love the way many men of his generation and temperament showed love. Through reliability, through showing up, through the specific quiet attentiveness of someone who remembered the details of your life, without ever making a production of having remembered them. My brother Cole is 42 years old, 3 years older than me, and has spent most of his adult life in a pattern that I will describe as carefully as I can, because precision matters more here than venting. A series of business ventures that consistently required family financial support to launch and consistently failed to sustain themselves once that support was withdrawn. 2 marriages that ended in divorces that were, by Cole's own account each time, not really my fault, and a relationship with our father that had become, over the final decade of Dad's life, almost entirely transactional. Visits that coincided suspiciously often with financial requests, attention that flowed toward our father, primarily when our father had something to offer. I do not say this with satisfaction. I say it because it is the necessary context for understanding what our father eventually decided to do. And because I loved my brother, complicatedly and imperfectly, the entire time I was also watching this pattern unfold with the specific clear-eyed attention that my profession had trained into me. I had a different relationship with my father. I visited weekly, not because I was asked to, but because I wanted to. I drove him to his cardiology appointments after his first stroke, 4 years before his death. I sat with him, on Sunday afternoons, doing nothing in particular, Watching golf he only half-watched, eating the specific terrible diner food his cardiologist had told him to stop eating, which he ordered anyway, and which I never reported back to anyone, because some small defiances, I had decided, belonged to him alone in his final years. I did not do any of this expecting to be rewarded for it financially. I want to be completely clear about that, because it matters to how I received the news of the dollar. And it matters even more to what I eventually learned about why he structured things exactly the way he did. I need to plant several details here, because they are the entire architecture of what follows. The first. Approximately 2 years before his death, my father had a long conversation with me, unprompted, on one of our Sunday afternoons, about his estate planning. He had mentioned, in passing, that he had been working with an attorney, not the family's longtime general practice lawyer, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who had handled minor matters for our family for decades, but a different attorney, a woman named Harriet Boswell, who specialized specifically in estate planning and probate litigation defense. Why a different attorney? I had asked, mostly out of idle curiosity at the time. Gerald's a good man, my father had said. But he's not the kind of lawyer you need when you're trying to build something that can't be picked apart afterward. I want this done by someone who specializes in exactly that. I had not asked at the time what picked apart meant, or by whom. I filed the comment away, the way I file most things, without yet understanding its full weight. The second detail. Approximately 14 months before his death, my father asked me, during another of our Sunday visits, whether I remembered the specific timeline of Cole's last 3 financial requests to him. The amounts, the stated purposes, whether Cole had ever repaid any portion of what he'd received. I told him I did not have exact figures memorized, but that I could reconstruct a rough timeline if it mattered to him. It matters, he said. Not for any argument, just for my own records. I want to understand the actual pattern, not just my impression of it. I had, over the following weeks, pulled together what I could recall and what I could verify through old text messages and a few emails Cole had sent our father requesting specific amounts for specific stated purposes. A failed restaurant venture, a bridge loan during one of his divorces, a down payment on a car that he had, 6 months later, mentioned needing to sell again due to cash flow issues. I had given my father this reconstructed timeline, organized simply by date and amount, not realizing at the time that I was essentially building a piece of documentary evidence that would later become legally significant. The total, across roughly 9 years, came to just under $140,000, none of which Cole had ever repaid, none of which had ever been formally documented as a loan rather than a gift, and almost none of which my father had ever mentioned to me directly at the time it occurred, meaning I had been, without fully realizing it, gradually reconstructing a financial history my father had kept almost entirely private even from me, his other child, for nearly a decade. The third detail. 8 months before his death, my father called me on a Thursday evening and asked if I could come by that weekend, alone, without mentioning the visit to Cole beforehand. I had found this request slightly unusual. My father was not typically a man who orchestrated secrecies, but I had agreed without much further thought, assuming it concerned something private about his health that he simply did not want to discuss with both his children present. When I arrived that Saturday, he had a folder on the kitchen table, and Harriet Boswell joined us by video call for approximately 40 minutes, walking through, in careful and deliberate language, exactly what he intended to do with his estate, and exactly why he intended to do it the way he was planning, including a specific clause that he wanted me to understand fully before he finalized anything. "I'm going to leave Cole almost everything," he told me, directly, watching my face as he said it. "I need you to hear that plainly, from me, before you ever hear it from a lawyer in a conference room." I sat with that for a long moment. "Okay," I said. "I appreciate you telling me yourself. I also need you to understand something else," he said. "The part you're going to see in the will itself is not actually the part that matters. I need you to trust me on that. Even though I can't fully explain it to you today, because some of what I'm setting up depends on it staying structured exactly the way Harriet and I have planned, without either of us discussing the details with Cole or with you in advance. I did not fully understand, in that kitchen, exactly what he meant. I trusted him anyway, because the entire shape of our relationship, across 39 years, had given me ample reason to. There is a particular kind of patience required of a person who is told, directly and honestly, that almost everything will go to someone else. And who chooses, despite the sting of that information, to trust the person telling them rather than immediately assuming the worst. That patience is not naivety. It is, sometimes, the most accurate read available, when the person asking for your trust has spent an entire lifetime earning it through, means considerably more substantial than money. The will reading was scheduled for a Tuesday in March, 6 weeks after my father's funeral, at Harriet Boswell's office in Dublin, Ohio. A quiet, professional space with a long conference table, a row of windows overlooking a small courtyard, and the specific institutional calm that estate attorneys' offices seem to cultivate deliberately, the calm designed for exactly the kind of difficult conversations that happen inside them. Cole arrived 10 minutes before the scheduled time, dressed, I noted, with a specific care that struck me, even then, as oddly celebratory for the occasion. A new watch I did not recognize. A confidence in his posture that suggested he had already, in his own mind, settled the outcome of a meeting that had not yet begun. I want to be honest about my own state of mind walking into that room. I did not expect an equal split. My father had told me, 8 months earlier, exactly what to expect from the will itself, and I had spent those 8 months making peace. As much as anyone can make peace with something like that, with the reality that the house, the investment accounts, and the lake cabin our family had used for vacations throughout my childhood would all be going to my brother. What I had not fully prepared for, because my father, true to his word, had never explained it to me in advance, was the specific, deliberate staging of how the reading itself would unfold. Harriet began with the formal, procedural opening any will reading requires, confirming identities, establishing that this was the most recent valid version of Desmond Ferreira's last will and testament, dated 11 months before his death, properly witnessed and notarized. She then proceeded through the document's provisions in order. The house in Westerville, valued at approximately $420,000. To Cole Ferreira, in full. The investment and retirement accounts, totaling approximately $310,000, to Cole Ferreira, in full. The lake cabin in Hocking County, valued at approximately $190,000, to Cole Ferreira, in full. The remaining personal property, including vehicles and the contents of the Westerville house, to Cole Ferreira, in full. And finally the specific clause I had been told to expect. To my daughter, Odalys Ferreira, the sum of $1, taped to this page, in recognition of her status as my daughter and a named beneficiary of this will. Cole, beside me, had gone very still during the reading of his own bequests. Not with any visible discomfort, but with the specific satisfied stillness of a man confirming, point by point, that an expectation he had clearly been carrying for some time was being precisely fulfilled. When Harriet reached my own clause, he turned toward me, and I want to describe his expression honestly. It was not unkind, exactly, but it carried a specific, almost apologetic satisfaction, the expression of someone who believes he has won something and feels, in the winning, a small obligation to soften the loser's landing with a sympathetic look. "I'm sorry, Odalys," he said quietly as Harriet continued reading the remaining boilerplate provisions. "I know that's rough. I'll make sure you're taken care of, though. I'm not going to just leave you with nothing." I did not respond to this immediately, in part because Harriet was still speaking, and in part because I was holding, internally, the specific knowledge my father had given me 8 months earlier, that the will itself was not, in his own words, the part that matters. Harriet completed the formal reading of the will, set the document down, and then said, in the same calm, unhurried voice she had used throughout, Before we conclude, there's one additional item Mr. Ferreira asked me to address at this specific meeting, separate from the will itself. She reached into a folder and produced a sealed envelope, heavier than standard mail stock, with a notary's embossed seal visible across the flap, my father's signature beside it, and a date, 4 months before his death. This document is not part of the probate estate, Harriet said. It was executed separately, as an inter vivos trust instrument, meaning it took legal effect during Mr. Ferreira's lifetime rather than through his will. Because of that, its contents are not subject to probate, are not part of the estate the will you just heard describes, and cannot be contested through any challenge to the will itself, because it was never part of the will to begin with. I watched Cole's expression shift in real time, from the settled satisfaction of moments earlier into something considerably more uncertain. "What is it?" he said. "I'm going to read it aloud, exactly as Mr. Ferreira instructed," Harriet said. He was very specific that both of his children needed to hear it together, in this room, immediately following the will reading, and not before. There is a particular kind of architecture available to a person building an estate plan, who understands, with complete clarity, exactly how the people in their family will react to a document, and who designs not just the content of that document, but the precise sequence in which its pieces will be revealed, so that the full picture only becomes visible at the exact moment it is meant to. Harriet broke the seal carefully, in the specific, unhurried manner of someone who understood the document's significance, and intended to honor it through the precision of its delivery. She began reading. My father had established, 4 months before his death, a revocable living trust, which had, upon his death, automatically and immediately converted into an irrevocable trust under its own terms, a standard and entirely legal structure that estate attorneys use specifically to move assets outside the probate process while a person is still alive, ensuring those assets pass according to the trust's terms rather than through the will, and rather than through the kind of public, contestable probate proceeding that a will reading represents. The trust held 3 specific assets that I had never known existed in any formal financial sense, because my father had structured the underlying transaction so quietly over the preceding 2 years, that even I, visiting weekly, paying close attention, the daughter he had trusted enough to share his planning intentions with 8 months earlier, had not understood their full scope until that exact moment in Harriet's office. The first, the actual operating proceeds from the sale of his HVAC business 8 years earlier. I had known, in a general sense, that my father had sold the company. I had not known that he had structured the sales proceeds, nearly $800,000, into a series of conservative investments held inside this trust, rather than in any of the accounts the will had just described, specifically because, as the trust document explained in his own recorded language, he did not want the company's sale proceeds, representing 31 years of actual labor, exposed to the same probate process and family dynamics that I expect will surround the disposition of the house and the more visible accounts. The second, a separate, fully funded education trust, established 3 years earlier, for my 2 children, my father's grandchildren, covering, per the document's specific language, the full cost of undergraduate and, if pursued, graduate education at any accredited institution administered by Odalys as trustee, with funds released directly to educational institutions rather than to any intermediary account. The third, and the provision Harriet read last, in the same level voice she had maintained throughout, a specific and detailed accounting of every financial transfer my father had made to Cole over the preceding 9 years, the same timeline I had helped him reconstruct 14 months earlier, now formalized, dated, and totaled at $138,400, followed by a clause stating that this amount, having already been received by Cole during my father's lifetime, would be formally treated, for the purposes of this trust's separate distribution, as Cole's complete advance inheritance from the trust's assets specifically, distinct entirely from whatever Cole received through the will. In other words, Harriet said, looking up from the document, addressing both of us directly. Your father is stating, formally and for the legal record, that Cole's distribution from this trust has already occurred, in full, across the prior 9 years, and that no further trust funds will be distributed to him. She continued reading. The trust's remaining assets, the $800,000 in business sale proceeds, after accounting for the Education Trust's separate allocation, were to be distributed entirely to me. I sat very still, the specific, careful stillness I bring to reviewing any document whose full implications I am still in the process of absorbing. Cole, beside me, made a sound that I can only describe, in retrospect, as the sound of a man whose entire understanding of his own financial future had just been restructured, in real time, by a voice reading calmly from a piece of paper. That's not, he started, and then stopped, his hand visibly unsteady on the conference table. Mr. Ferreira, Harriet said gently. Are you all right? He can't do that, Cole said, his voice carrying a specific rising distress that I had rarely heard from him before. He can't just decide, after the fact, that money I already spent counts as my whole inheritance. That's not how any of this is supposed to work. I want to be precise about what's legally true here, Harriet said, with the same calm, unhurried patience she had maintained throughout the entire reading. Your father is not retroactively reclassifying gifts he never characterized as inheritance advances at the time he made them. What he has done, through this trust document, is formally and legally declare, as the grantor of this trust and the original source of those funds, his clear and final intent regarding how those transfers should be treated relative to the trust's separate assets. He had the legal right, during his lifetime, to structure his own assets exactly this way, and the documentation establishing both the transfer history and his stated intent is thorough, dated, and was executed while he retained full legal capacity, confirmed by a physician's evaluation conducted the same week, which is also part of this file. This is insane, Cole said. He had gone by this point genuinely pale, his breathing visibly shallow, and I want to note, with real concern rather than any satisfaction, that the paralegal sitting near the door had risen and was moving toward him with a chair. Recognizing, before I fully did, that whatever was happening to my brother in that moment was not simply emotional distress, but something closer to a physical collapse. Cole, I said, reaching toward him. Sit down, breathe. He sat heavily, in the chair the paralegal had brought, his hand pressed against his chest, his breathing audible and uneven. I need a moment, he said. Give me a moment. We gave him several minutes. Harriet offered water, which he accepted with a shaking hand. The room held the specific, suspended quality of a space where something significant has just occurred, and everyone present understands that nothing said in the next several minutes will be as important as simply allowing the moment itself to pass. Once Cole's breathing had steadied, Harriet continued. There's one final provision, she said, in the form of a personal letter your father asked me to read aloud, separate from the formal trust language. The letter, in my father's own words, read aloud by Harriet in the same measured voice, explained what he wanted us both to understand. He wrote that he had spent the final 2 years of his life thinking carefully, and with real pain, about how to structure his estate in a way that reflected what had actually happened in his family across the preceding decade, rather than what either of his children might wish had happened, or might prefer to believe had happened. He wrote that he loved Cole completely, and that nothing in this document should be read as a rejection of that love. He wrote that he had given Cole, across 9 years, far more financial support than he had ever given Odalys, not because he loved one child more, but because Cole had asked, repeatedly and with genuine need each time, and Desmond had never been able to say no to a child in front of him asking for help. Regardless of the pattern those requests eventually formed, he wrote that he had structured the will itself, the house, the accounts, the cabin, all visibly and entirely to Cole, specifically because he wanted Cole to have something substantial and undeniable to point to, something that would let him hold his head up in front of extended family and friends, without anyone whispering that he had been cut out or treated as lesser. He wrote that he had structured the trust separately, and specifically asked that it be revealed only after the will's reading, because he needed Cole to fully receive, register, and sit with the visible inheritance first. Needed him to feel, completely and without qualification, that he had been given everything that mattered, before learning the more complicated truth underneath it. That the actual, full accounting of fairness between his two children had already been settled. Years earlier, through transfers, Cole had requested and received, and that the trust's remaining assets, the ones representing 31 years of his own labor, building something from a single truck, belonged to the child who had never once asked him for anything beyond his time and his presence. He wrote, "Odalys, I left you $1 in the will because Harriet told me, and I came to understand and agree that naming you formally with even the smallest amount means the will cannot later be challenged on the grounds that I simply forgot you or failed to consider you. The dollar was never the gift. The dollar was the door I needed to leave open, so that everything behind it could not be pried loose by anyone arguing that you'd been overlooked. You were never overlooked. You were the only one I never had to worry about overlooking, because you never once asked me to remember you. I remembered you anyway. I remembered everything," he wrote, in the letter's final line. "Cole, I hope this does not feel like punishment, because it was never designed as one. It is simply, finally, the truth, written down the way I should have written it down years ago. Instead of letting kindness in the moment quietly become an imbalance neither of us ever had to examine honestly until now." Harriet set the letter down. The room was silent. There is a particular kind of grief available only to a person hearing, for the first time, an accurate and complete account of patterns they had always sensed but never been forced to fully examine. The grief not of losing something, but of finally seeing clearly something that had always been true, and understanding that the seeing cannot be undone now that it has happened. Cole did not speak for several minutes after Harriet finished reading the letter. When he finally did, his voice carried none of the rising distress from earlier, simply a flat, exhausted quality, the voice of a man who had run out of arguments before he had even finished forming them. "I didn't know he kept track like that," he said, eventually. "I never thought of it as, I never added it up. I just thought of each one as its own thing, its own situation." "I know," I said. "I don't think you were keeping a running total in your head the way Dad eventually did. I think that's part of what he was trying to explain in the letter. Each request probably did feel separate, in the moment, to both of you. It just wasn't separate. It was a pattern, the whole time, and he was the only one actually tracking it." "Did you know?" Cole asked. "About the trust. Before today I knew. He was leaving you almost everything in the will," I said. "I've known that for 8 months. He told me himself, directly, because he wanted me to hear it from him rather than from a lawyer. He did not tell me about the trust. I want you to believe that, because I think it matters to you right now, and because it's the truth." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you," he said. "You've never lied to me about anything, even when it would have been easier to." We sat together in that conference room for a while longer, neither of us in any particular hurry to leave, the specific shared exhaustion of two adults who had just had their entire understanding of their family's financial history rewritten in the span of 40 minutes, settling over both of us, in a way that made ordinary conversation feel, for a time, beside the point. I want to tell you what happened in the months that followed, because I believe the resolution matters more than the dramatic reveal, even though the dramatic reveal is what makes this story worth telling at all. I did not gloat. I want to be direct about that, because I think it would be easy, in the retelling, to make this into a story about triumphant vindication, and that is not honestly how it felt to live through. What I felt, in the weeks after the will reading, was something closer to a complicated, grieving clarity. Grief for my father, deepened now by the specific knowledge of exactly how much careful, painful thought he had put into a structure designed to protect me without ever once making me feel like the protection was the point of our relationship, and clarity about a family pattern that had operated, quietly and unexamined, for nearly a decade, finally named and settled in a way that could not be relitigated or softened back into ambiguity. I established the education trust accounts for my children, exactly as my father's documentation specified, working with Harriet to ensure the administration matched his stated intent precisely. I retained the business sale proceeds, after the education trust's allocation, in the same conservative investment structure my father had originally established, making no immediate dramatic changes, because I understood, reading through his own notes on the underlying portfolio, that he had built something careful and deliberate that did not require my intervention to continue functioning exactly as intended. Cole kept the house, the accounts, and the cabin, the full, undisputed inheritance the will itself had described, exactly as our father had wanted him to keep it, without qualification or later clawback. I want to be clear that the trust's revelation did not strip Cole of anything the will had given him. It simply established formally and permanently that what he had already received over 9 years constituted his full share of the family's other major asset, the business proceeds, which meant he would not also be receiving a portion of the $800,000 in the trust. This distinction mattered enormously to how Cole and I eventually settled into our new understanding of each other. He did not lose anything he had been formally promised. He simply learned, finally and completely, the actual scope of what he had already taken, across years he had never fully added up himself. Cole and I had a longer conversation, 3 months after the will reading, at a coffee shop in Westerville, that our father used to take us both to on Saturday mornings when we were children. A detail neither of us had specifically chosen for the meeting, but that we both noted separately once we arrived. "I've been seeing someone," Cole said, "a financial counselor, not because the trust forced me into it exactly, though I won't pretend it didn't push me there faster than I'd have gotten on my own. I think I needed to actually look at the whole pattern, the way Dad apparently looked at it, instead of just feeling vaguely guilty about pieces of it without ever adding the pieces together." "That's a real step," I said. "I mean that genuinely, not as something polite to say." "I know you do," he said. "I'm working on actually paying some of it back. Not because the trust requires it. Harriet was very clear that it doesn't, that the document just formalizes what already happened, rather than creating any ongoing obligation. I'm doing it because I think I need to, for my own accounting of things, separate from whatever the legal paperwork says." "How much have you figured out so far?" I asked. "About $6,000, back to you, for the education trust specifically," he said. "I know it's not much against $138,000. I'm not pretending it evens anything out. I just wanted to start somewhere real, instead of just feeling bad about it indefinitely without ever actually doing anything." I looked at my brother, 42 years old, finally examining, with what appeared to be genuine and difficult honesty, a pattern that had taken our father's careful, posthumous documentation to finally make undeniable. "I appreciate that," I said. "I want you to know I'm not measuring our relationship by a dollar figure going forward. I never wanted that to be the metric between us. I think Dad didn't either, in the end. I think he wanted the metric to just finally be the truth, clearly stated, so we could both actually build something honest going forward, instead of something built on an imbalance neither of us were allowed to examine." "I think that's what he wanted," Cole said. "I just wish he'd told me directly, instead of needing a lawyer and a sealed envelope to do it for him." I thought about that for a long moment, because I believe it is the single most important question this entire story actually raises. "I don't think he could have told you directly," I said finally. "I think that's exactly why he built it this way. He couldn't say no to you in the moment, for 9 years, every time you asked. I don't think he could have sat across from you and said, calmly, 'This is the full pattern, and here's what it means for your inheritance,' without the conversation collapsing into the same dynamic that let the pattern continue in the first place. He needed something that couldn't be negotiated, argued with, or softened in the room. Something built so carefully, in advance, that by the time it was finally spoken aloud, there was nothing left to argue about. He needed the document to do what he could never quite bring himself to do himself. Cole was quiet for a long time, looking out the coffee shop window at the same street our father used to drive us down on Saturday mornings. Decades earlier, before either of us had any reason to imagine the family's eventual reckoning would look anything like what it actually became. "That sounds like him," Cole said, eventually. Not able to say it, needing to build it instead. "That's exactly him," I said. I kept the $1 bill. It is still taped, exactly as it was when Harriet first showed it to me, to the original page of the will, filed in a drawer alongside my father's other papers. Not because the dollar itself ever mattered, but because I have come to understand it as the most precise possible symbol of what my father actually believed about fairness, protection, and the specific, careful difference between what a document says on its surface and what it is actually built to do underneath. The dollar was never the inheritance. The dollar was the door. Everything that mattered was always on the other side of it, exactly where my father had placed it, exactly when he intended it to be found. A will is the visible document, read aloud in a room, witnessed and recorded and available, eventually, to anyone who requests it through the probate court. A trust, built quietly during a lifetime, and revealed on the builder's own schedule, is something else entirely. The part of a person's intentions that does not need to survive an argument, because it was never designed to be argued with in the first place. Some people build their most important truths in the visible document. The wisest ones sometimes build them underneath it, where no amount of disappointment in the room can reach them. And that was the year I understood that my father had spent the final 2 years of his life solving a problem he had never been able to solve in conversation. How to tell the truth about a pattern he had quietly, painfully watched unfold for nearly a decade, without that truth becoming just one more thing to be argued away in the moment, softened by guilt, or quietly ubbed back into the comfortable ambiguity that had let the pattern continue for so long. He left me $1. He left the truth in a sealed envelope, notarized, dated, and built to outlast any argument either of his children might have made in the room. The dollar was never an insult. It was the most careful, most deliberate act of protection my father ever built, and it held exactly as long as it needed to, exactly until the moment it was finally, completely, and permanently necessary.